In this part of our lecture on the somatosensory pathways, we're going to talk about the pathway for discriminative touch. Discriminative touch differs from coarse touch or crude touch in that while coarse touch gives us the awareness of being touched and triggers an emotional response to that touch, discriminative touch is giving us the specific qualities and location of that touch. There are several different receptors that provide different information that is then integrated in the brain to give us the discriminative properties of that touch. Some of these receptors are free nerve endings and some are encapsulated. They include the hair follicle receptors, Ruffini endings, Merkel's complex, Meissner's corpuscles, and Pacinian corpuscles. The first order afferent used in the discriminative touch pathway is an A beta. Therefore, discriminative touch uses our largest, most heavily myelinated, and fastest first order afferents. The discriminative touch pathway utilizes what's known as the dorsal column medial lemniscus system. This system contains two distinctive tracts. In the spinal cord, the tract is called the dorsal column. In truth, the dorsal column is made up of two smaller tracts, or fasciculi, but I'm not going to have you responsible for the names of those fasciculi. Instead, I would like you just to know the dorsal column, because that is what you're going to see clinically, and often in texts and articles, they will simply refer to the dorsal column and not the individual fasciculi. If you should run into an article for your presentation that talks about the fasciculi and you have questions on it, please feel free to ask. The dorsal column is located in the posteromedial aspect of the spinal cord. It is situated right between the two dorsal horns. In the brainstem, we have a second tract. This tract is known as the medial lemniscus. Lemniscus means ribbon. And apparently the anatomist who named this thought that it looked like a ribbon threading its way up through the brainstem. The medial lemniscus is located anteromedial in the medulla and the pons, and a bit more lateral in the midbrain. So in the spinal cord, the discriminative touch information is going to be traveling in a posterior aspect. But once it gets to the midbrain, it's going to move to the anterior part. Again, the information that is provided by these variety of receptors includes vibration, pressure, texture, stretching of the skin, and movement of the hair. Together, this allows us to give the qualities to that particular touch, as well as to specify location. It also allows us to distinguish if we have a single touch or if there is more than one touch. This is called two-point discrimination, and you will learn how to assess this in your clinical courses. Two-point discrimination is going to be more refined in areas where we have high sensitivity, such as on the pads of our fingers, than it will be on places like our back where we have less receptor density. The information that's traveling up the dorsal column is going to travel most medially if it's coming from the lower trunk or lower extremities, with the information coming from the sacral dermatomes being the most medial. And it's going to be more lateral if it's coming from the upper extremities or upper part of the trunk, with the upper cervical dermatomes traveling the most furthest lateral in the column. Here's the image that I gave you in the first part of our lecture on somatosensory pathways. So I'll refer you back to that particular slide if you'd like to look at it again. What I want to point out here is the dorsal column. That's the big blue area in the back, situated between the two dorsal horns. You'll notice that they have listed sacral, lumbar, thoracic, and cervical. So you can see how information coming in from the sacral dermatomes is situated most medially in that dorsal column. Lumbar comes in and is next, thoracic next, and finally cervical being the most lateral, right next to the dorsal horn. This prevents neurons from having to cross over each other as they are entering the pathway in order to ascend. It'd be similar to going to church. If you're the first one to arrive and you sit at the end of the pew, people who arrive after you have to cross in front of you, and then they might step on your foot or their backside might end up in your face, and it's much easier if you are the first one to arrive if you just simply slide yourself in to the center of the pew, and then people who come after you can simply come into the pew and sit down without having to step over other people. Here we have our spinal cord segment, and we're going to draw in the first order afferent in just a moment. You might recall that in both the pain pathway and the temperature pathway, the first order afferent entered the segment and went to the dorsal horn. Into the dorsal horn, it then synapsed on a second order neuron. And the second order neuron crossed over to the other side of the spinal cord, entered the spinal thalamic tract, and ascended up to the brainstem. That's not what's going to happen when it comes to discriminative touch. With discriminative touch, the first order neuron is going to enter the spinal cord segment, but instead of going to the dorsal horn, it's going to go to the dorsal column and ascend without synapsing. Here we have our first order afferent. I chose Meissner's corpuscle. You could select any of the discriminative touch receptors. We have our A beta first order afferent, cell body situated in the dorsal root ganglion. But you can see how the central axon doesn't go into the dorsal horn, but instead enters the dorsal column. Again, if this were coming from your foot, that would be, or your buttock, we would be more medial. If we're coming more from the upper extremity or from the neck region, we're going to be more lateral. But it enters the dorsal column and then it ascends up to the brainstem. So now let's talk a little bit about our pathway. For you read-write learners, this will be helpful to have it in more of a text format. Our discriminative touch receptor is stimulated. This is going to cause a modality-gated ion channel to open. If we have enough summation, because we have a strong enough stimulus, we're going to generate an action potential. This is going to propagate along the A beta first order afferent. The cell body for our A beta first order afferent is in the dorsal root ganglion. The central axon is going to travel up the dorsal column. It will have its axon terminal in a nucleus in the posteromedial aspect of the caudal medulla. Now, there are two different nuclei involved, but I'm not going to ask you to distinguish between these nuclei. So this is one of the few times that you will not have to know the actual name of the nucleus. But I do want you to know its location. So it's in the posterior medial aspect of the medulla oblongata. Caudal telling us it's in the inferior aspect. So our dorsal column basically ends where the spinal cord and the brainstem meet. In this nucleus, our first order afferent is going to synapse with the second order neuron. The second order neuron is going to cross midline and it's going to go to the contralateral anteromedial aspect of the caudal medulla, where it's now going to enter the medial lemniscus. It's going to travel up the medial lemniscus to the ventral posterolateral nucleus of the thalamus. Here it's going to synapse with a third order neuron. The third order neuron will go to the primary somatosensory cortex of the parietal lobe, and discriminative touch perception will now occur. Let's draw in our complete pathway. I've chosen the palmar aspect of the distal thumb. I again decided to use a Meissner's corpuscle. We have an A beta first order afferent. My cutaneous innervation tells me that that is traveling in the median nerve. I've got the cell body in the dorsal root ganglion. It enters into the spinal cord segment, and because it's the thumb, my dermatome tells me it's entering the 6th cervical spinal cord segment. It ascends in the dorsal column up to the caudal aspect of the medulla. Now in this particular drawing, it would be too difficult to try and show medial and lateral very clearly because it's just too small. But I want you to keep in mind that we're more posteromedial in that caudal medulla. There it synapses in a nucleus. The second order neuron crosses midline and travels up in the medial lemniscus. The medial lemniscus now is anteromedial, so it's on the anterior aspect and it's quite medially located. We get around mid pons, maybe just a little higher, and then this is going to start to deviate a little bit to get a little bit more lateral in the midbrain. But we're going to ascend all the way up into our thalamus, where we're going to synapse in the ventral posterolateral nucleus of the thalamus. The third order neuron is going to go to the lateral aspect of the primary somatosensory cortex. Because we're talking the hand, we need to be more lateral, and this is going to be on the parietal lobe. This is not something you're going to be tested on. I just want to give you an idea of the location differences for the medial lemniscus when we're in the caudal medulla as compared to once we get into the midbrain. The red circles or ovals represent the spinal thalamic tract. The green ovals represent the medial lemniscus. So what I want you to see here is how when we're in the medulla, that these structures, we have the spinal thalamic tract quite lateral and the medial lemniscus very medial. Once we get to the midbrain, they're more equivalent when it comes to medial lateral. They are pretty much, although you can't really tell necessarily from this picture, but in the midbrain, both sets of tracts are more lateral. So now I've got some brainstorm questions for you. What happens to the sensations on one side of the body if we have an injury to the peripheral nerve? What happens to the sensations on one side of the body if we have an injury to one side of the spinal cord? What happens to the sensations on one side of the body if we have an injury on one side of the brainstem? And what happens to the sensations on one side of the body if we have an injury to one of the cerebral hemispheres? I want you to talk about this online and help each other to figure out how you would know what the answers would be. Just to do a little bit of brainstorming and get you started, let's add in some injuries. This is our discriminative touch pathway that you just saw, but now I'm going to add in some injuries. Here's my injury to the peripheral nerve. What happens to discriminative touch on the right side of the body? What about on the left side of the body? Now I've damaged the spinal cord. What happens if I've damaged one side of the spinal cord? What happens to sensation on the right side of the body versus the left? Now I've damaged the left side of my brainstem. What's happening to sensation on the right side of my body versus the left side of my body. And now the cerebrum. You want to do this for each of your tracks that we've talked about so far, so that you can get a good sense of what information is going to be impacted by injuries at different locations within the pathway.